Hey guys, Assalamualaikum. Welcome back to another virtual lecture. In this video, we will begin our series of lectures on international trade. But before that, why do you think we need to learn about international trade? It's because we live in a global marketplace. What that means is the food on our table might include some fresh fruits from the US, some cheese from Germany, and bottled water from the UK. Our wireless phone might have been made in Taiwan or Korea. The clothes that we wear might be designed in Italy and manufactured in China. What that means is we are all linked by international trade, and the volume of trade has grown dramatically in the last few decades. That is why we need to learn about it. So what does international trade mean? In terms of definition, international trade is the exchange or the activity of buying and selling of goods and services between different countries. Trading globally gives consumers and countries the opportunity to be exposed to goods and services that are not available in their own countries or which would have been more expensive domestically. So now let's take a look at why do nations trade? Now the easiest answer to this question is that nations trade simply because it brings them more benefits. Now the benefits that emerge relate to three underlying facts, which are the distribution of economic resources among nations is uneven. Efficient production of various goods requires different technologies or combinations of resources, and products are differentiated among nations, and some people just prefer imports. For instance, China. China has an abundant and inexpensive labor. As a result, China can produce a variety of labor-intensive goods efficiently, such as textiles, electronics, apparel, toys, and sporting goods. In contrast, Australia has a large amounts of land and can inexpensively produce such land-intensive goods such as beef, wool, and meat. Industrially advanced economies like the United States and Germany have relatively large amounts of capital, so they can inexpensively produce goods which production requires much capital, including such capital-intensive goods like airplanes, automobiles, agricultural equipment, machineries, and chemicals. Also, regardless of their resource intensities, nations can develop individual products that are in demand worldwide because of their special qualities. For instance, fashion are best known from France and Italy, skincare from South Korea, chocolates from Belgium, software from the United States, and watches are best known from Switzerland. Now, this distribution of resources, technology, and product distinctiveness among nations are not fixed forever. Okay, so certainly things can change over time. Now, when that happens, the relative efficiency and success that nations have in producing and selling goods may also change. So, as you can see, international trade brings a lot of benefits to all of us, right? In fact, the American statesman Benjamin Franklin once said, "No nation was ever ruined by trade." Many economists would express their attitude toward international trade in an even more positive manner. The evidence that international trade confers overall benefits on economies is pretty strong. Now, as of now, there's no modern example of any country that has shut itself off from world trade and yet prospered. So, to understand more of the benefits of trade, we need to understand what are absolute advantage and comparative advantage. Okay guys, so what is absolute advantage? Okay, so absolute advantage is basically the decision to specialize a product based on comparing actual output. What that means is nations will specialize a good that it can produce in greater quantity. So usually countries which are bigger in size, they'll be able to produce bigger quantities or more goods, right? So by definition of the absolute advantage, those bigger nations would be able to specialize in those production. Now, that would certainly be a disadvantage to smaller nations, right? Because smaller nations may not have the necessary resources or technology in order to produce things in greater amount. So how can they compete on a fair footing? So that is why in 1817, David Ricardo, who is a businessman, economist, and a member of the British Parliament, he wrote a treatise called On the Principles of Political Economy and Taxation. In that treatise, Ricardo argued that specialization and free trade can benefit all trading partners, even those which are smaller in size and may be relatively inefficient. How? It's not by absolute advantage, rather through the concept of comparative advantage. Okay, so to understand what David Ricardo meant, let's take a look back at absolute advantage. Under absolute advantage, the decision to specialize on producing a particular product or good is based on which country can produce the greater quantity. What that means is, the more you can produce, then you have the right to specialize on that product, okay? However, under comparative advantage, that's not the case. Under comparative advantage, the decision to specialize a product is based on who has the lower opportunity cost of producing the product. What that means is, regardless of the size of the country, if that country has a lower opportunity cost to produce something, then that country should be the one who specializes on producing that product. Here's an excerpt of my lecture notes. Okay, so hopefully you'll be able to read this part and try to understand what I've explained before. Okay, so before we go on and do some examples, we need to make several assumptions. Okay, now we assume that there are only two nations involved. Okay, of course, in practice, that's not the case. We've got multiple countries trading with each other, but for simplicity purposes and for us to understand the concept at the very basic, we just assume that there are only two nations involved in international trade. Okay, and we also assume that both of these nations, or each of these nations, can produce the same two goods. Okay, same goods, however, they're producing at different levels of efficiency. Now, this is important because if they're producing the same goods at the same levels of efficiency, there will not be any comparative advantage of one nation over the other. Okay, so this is very important. Thirdly, we also assume that both countries have constant costs. Okay, so the implication of this is their PPC, or the production possibilities curve, would be a straight line. All right, so it's constant cost. And finally, we assume that both nations have different costs. Now, their costs are constant, meaning it's a straight line. However, they're not of the same slope. Okay? All right, so now let's do an example. Now, from our assumption, we have two nations. Let's say we have the United States, okay, and Brazil. Okay, so these are our two nations. And each of these nations produce the same two goods, which are wheat and coffee. Okay? So they produce these two goods. And okay, so let's say this particular production possibilities table is given, okay? 30, 10, 30, 20. Okay, what this means is US will be able to produce wheat by this amount. US is also able to produce coffee by this amount. Brazil can produce wheat by this amount. And Brazil can produce coffee by this amount. So now, if we use the absolute advantage definition, we can see that US would be specializing both wheat and coffee because US is producing more of both wheat and coffee compared to Brazil, right? 30 is more than 10, 30 is more than 20. So under absolute advantage, US is specializing in both production. Okay, so now I'm going to show you how we can determine which country should be specializing in what using comparative advantage. But before that, let's sketch both of these nations' PPC, okay, or production possibilities curve. Now let's sketch for US first. Okay, so this is the PPC for the United States. Okay, so let's take coffee at the vertical axis and wheat here. Okay, as we've seen here, US, the maximum amount of wheat production is 30. Okay, so let's say 0, 10, 20, 30. Okay, if you have a ruler, it'll be better. Okay, so you'll have the scale to be a bit more precise than just by doing it freehand like this. Okay, so US, for US, the maximum amount of wheat that it can produce is 30. So here, here. And the maximum amount of coffee that US can produce is also 30 here. So you take a ruler and just connect these two. Okay, so here we have the PPC for US, okay, in terms of the production. Okay, now let's do the same for Brazil. Okay, so this is for Brazil, and again, it has to be the same axis. Okay, so if here's wheat, here should be wheat as well. And here is coffee. Now remember, from the table, the maximum amount of wheat that Brazil can produce is 10, and the maximum amount of coffee that Brazil can produce is 20. So let's use the same dimensions just now, 10, 20, 30. Okay, 10, 20, and 30. So Brazil produces a maximum of 20 coffee and 10 wheat, okay? Okay, again, take a ruler and just connect them. Okay, so here we have the PPC for Brazil in both of these goods production. Okay, so as you can see, this is what it means by, our assumptions earlier. We only have 2 nations. Each of these nations produce the same goods. And here we can see that since the PPC is a straight line, what it means is these nations, we assume them to have constant costs. And because their shapes, or rather their steepness is different, we assume that these nations have different costs. Okay, so this is very important for us to show the comparative advantage. All right, so now let's calculate the opportunity cost of producing both of these output for each country. Okay, we'll start with the US. Okay, so you can either use this diagram that you've plotted, or you can just refer back to the production possibilities table. Okay, so let's say we're using this as a point of reference. Okay, so now let's calculate the opportunity cost of producing 30 wheat. Okay, to those who don't know, okay, let's try to understand this diagram again. What this means is US is able to produce a maximum of 30 coffee and a maximum of 30 wheat. Now, if you remember back on the topic of production possibilities curve, for a particular country, you have to choose, right, 1 point on the PPC. You cannot be at both. Meaning, if US decides to be here, what it means is US is producing only 30 coffee and 0 wheat. If US decides to be at this point, then US is producing 30 wheat and 0 coffee. Or if US decides to be at any of the points along this line, so it's only 1 point, okay? Get what I mean? So US has to make a choice, all right? So now let's say if US wants to produce 30 wheat, okay, let's say it wants to max out all of the total amount of wheat that's possible to produce. So if US decides to produce 30 wheat, how many or how much coffee must they sacrifice or forgo? 30 lah, okay? See, if US wants to produce 30 wheat, it's going to produce 0 coffee. What it means is it is sacrificing or foregoing 30 units of coffee. So let's write it down. Okay, so the opportunity cost of producing 30 wheat is 30 coffee, right? Very simple. Okay, so in other words, the opportunity cost of producing 1 wheat, okay, how to do this is we just divide both sides with 30, is 1 coffee. Okay, so basically this is the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of wheat for US. So how about the opportunity cost of producing 1 coffee? To produce 1 unit of coffee, US needs to forgo 1 wheat. Okay, so we can write it this way, or we can write it this way as well. Okay, because we need to calculate the opportunity cost of producing both products, both goods for US. Okay, now let's calculate the opportunity cost of producing both products for Brazil. Okay, so from this diagram, we can see that if Brazil decides to produce 10 wheat, it will produce 0 coffee. What that means is it is sacrificing 20 units of coffee, right? So 10 wheat, it needs to sacrifice or forgo 20 coffee. In other words, the opportunity cost of producing 1 wheat is, okay, so we need to divide both sides, okay, with 10. Here becomes 2. Okay, so the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of wheat is 2 coffee. So what is the opportunity cost of producing 1 coffee? So it's just dividing it both sides with 2 now, so we can get 1 coffee means half, or 0.5 of wheat. Okay, now let's zoom out and let me say it again. Okay, the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of wheat is 1 coffee, and the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of coffee is 1 wheat. Okay, so this is for US. And here, the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of wheat is 2 coffee for Brazil, and the opportunity cost of producing 1 unit of coffee is half of wheat. Okay, so now let's decide which country should specialize in producing wheat. So what we need to do is we need to compare this ratio with this ratio. Okay, because this is the opportunity cost for US and this is the opportunity cost for Brazil. Now, one wheat. So, but which coffee is lower in terms of being forgone? Okay, so we can see here 1, right? This is 1 coffee and 2 coffee. So which has the lower opportunity cost? US. So here we can say US has a comparative advantage in producing wheat. Okay, so now let's move on and look at the opportunity cost for coffee. Okay, so now we need to compare the one under here. 1 coffee equivalent to 1 wheat, and here 1 coffee equivalent to half a wheat. So in this case, in terms of coffee production, which country should specialize in coffee? We compare 1 wheat here, half a wheat here. So obviously half is smaller, right? So we can see that Brazil has a comparative advantage in producing coffee. Okay, so from what we've done just now, we can see that nations with lower opportunity cost have comparative advantage and should specialize on that product, right? So US would be specializing in wheat, okay, and Brazil, from our calculation just now, would be specializing in coffee. Okay, so now this table will illustrate the gains from trade, okay, or the gains of specialization. Now let's begin with the first column, so you can ignore the rest of the column first, okay. Okay, and this first column is basically the condition before trade, okay, before specialization is before trade. As you can see, both nations produce both goods, right? US produces a bit of wheat, a bit of coffee, and Brazil also produces a bit of wheat and a bit of coffee. So this was in the case of no trade, right? Now, from our calculation just now, we've decided that US should specialize in wheat and Brazil should specialize in coffee, right? So this is the case when there is trade. You can see that US only produces wheat. That's what specialization means, right? Focusing on what you're good at. So US would be producing wheat, 0 coffee, and Brazil would be maximizing or specializing and producing only coffee and 0 wheat. Why these figures, 30 and 20? It's from the table that's given to you, all right? Because that is their maximum amount of output that they can produce given their nation's resources and technology. So now, since each country is just producing 1 good, right? So they will obviously need to trade with each other, right? So that they can have a taste of the other good. All right, so let's say US decides to, okay, minus means export, okay, because they are producing 30 wheat. So let's say US exports 10 wheat. Okay, so how many wheat is left for them? It's still a lot, still 20. Okay, so in this case, after trade, okay, so US would still be able to have 20 wheat and 15 coffee because they've decided to import 15 coffee. Okay, and in case of Brazil, here, okay, of course the amount would be the same, because they are trading partners. So whatever is being exported here would be imported by the other country. Here, whatever is being imported is being exported by the other country. Okay, so after trade, Brazil will be able to have 10 wheat, okay, and 5 coffee. Okay, how do we get this? We just minus this column against this column. This is the column of this, this is the total amount of output that they're producing with trade. This is the amount of trade happening, and this is the amount after trade, okay? Now, to see the gains from trade and specialization, what we need to do is we need to minus column 4 and column 1. Okay, so this is the case before trade, no trade. This is the case after trade, so we want to see what's the difference, because we want to show you that with trade, both nations can benefit. Okay, so here, before trade, US only produces 18 wheat, okay? Whereas after trading, US is able to have 20 wheat. So there's an additional of 2 wheat, right? So this is the gains from trade in terms of wheat for US. And before trade, US only produces 12 coffee, Okay, so after trading, meaning they're importing 15, so the difference, 12 and 15 is 3 coffee. Okay, so can you see the difference here? This is basically what US managed to gain from trade, from specialization. Now let's look for Brazil. Before trade, Brazil is producing only 8 wheat and 4 coffee. Okay, but now after specializing and trading, you can see that Brazil has 10 wheats and 5 coffee, which is an increment of 2 wheat and 1 coffee. Can you see that after specializing and trading, both nations have more of both goods? So that's basically their gains from specialization and trade. All right, so from our example just now, we can see that several gains from trade are apparent. Okay, number one, we can see that both nations have more of both goods, right? So both nations have more of both goods. Okay, so that's one. Secondly, we can see that there's more efficient use of resources, right? Because otherwise, US would be producing both wheat and coffee, and Brazil would be producing both wheat and coffee. But after specialization, both countries specialize or focus on what they're good at. So by that way, they'll be able to have a more efficient use of resource allocation. So more efficient. Okay, so this is what it means by more efficient use of resource allocation. Okay, and thirdly, both nations will be better off, okay, because, well, yeah, since they have more of both goods, they are more better off compared to when they were self-sufficient or before trade. Okay, so both nations are better off, okay, compared to when they were self-sufficient. Self-sufficient meaning before trade. In case you're wondering, where do we get all of these figures? This could be any point on the PPC, okay? It could be any point. And you can see that regardless of whatever points given to you, we will always, or the countries will always benefit from trade. Okay, so here, these are the gains from trade for the countries individually. What about the world trade? You can also see that world trade has also increased. World trade has more wheat first. Okay, by how much? 2 wheat plus 2 wheat. So there's an additional of 4. Okay, so there's an additional of 4 wheats. And there's also an increase in the world trade of coffee. Okay, by how much? 3 coffee plus 1 coffee. So again, there's a plus 4 units of coffee. So it's not just benefiting the nations individually, but the world trade also benefits when there's specialization and trade. Okay, so now let's move on to the terms of trade. Now, as mentioned before, since each nation would like, some of both goods, they will be trading. So the question is, how much will be traded? Okay, in other words, what are the ratio or exchange ratios that US and Brazil would trade wheat and coffee? So this is basically what terms of trade means. Okay, so where do we get these ratios? It's actually from the calculation of our opportunity cost just now. For the US, it will not give up more than 1 wheat for each coffee to benefit from the exchange, right? Similarly, for Brazil, they will not trade more than 2 coffee for 1 wheat to benefit from the exchange. So this basically sets the limits to the terms of trade, okay? In other words, US would want to import as much coffee as possible for each ton of wheat, but Brazil would want to export as little coffee as possible. Okay, so the rate of exchange can be anywhere or somewhere between 1 and 2 coffee for each wheat. Okay, so the actual terms of trade within these limits, it actually depends on the bargaining power of each country, because there's actually no exact answer for how much should be the amount of trade. Okay, guys, so we're now back at this table. As a result of specialization and trade, okay, so we can see that for both countries, US and Brazil, they managed to increase their level of output for both goods, okay, as compared to their state before specialization, right? Can you see here? So we've seen before that there's a gains for both the output by this much. So now what we'd like to do is we'd like to illustrate this in a form of an expanded production possibilities curve so that hopefully you can understand gains from trade better. All right, guys, say the international terms of trade is this, okay? So for every 1 wheat, they'll be trading 1.5 units of coffee, okay? So now the possibility of trading on these terms will permit both nations to expand their domestic production possibilities curve, okay, with a trading possibilities line, okay? So I'm going to show you how to get that. Okay, guys, so we're now looking back at the original production possibilities curve belonging to the US. So we can see here that from the calculation of our opportunity cost before, we can see that whenever US wants to increase 1 more unit of wheat, it has to forego or sacrifice 1 unit of coffee, right? So in other words, the domestic production of US is limited to be within this frontier. Okay, so that's why it's called a PPC or a PPF, meaning you cannot go beyond this line. Okay, but then just now, once we've seen from this table that with trade, okay, so US is able to import more coffee. Can you see there? Plus 15. So what happens here is, so their maximum amount of coffee is no longer at 30, but if you plus 15, it will be around here, okay, 45, right? Okay. However, for the amount of wheat, this is the maximum amount that they're producing, right? Because from specialization, US is specializing and only focusing on wheat. So, in other words, you can see that their existing PPC has managed to fan out. Okay, so this extra or new line here is called the trading possibilities line. Okay, so in other words, the US can have more coffee and at the same time, of course, having more wheat. So this is what it means by gains from trade for US. So in case you're wondering how we managed to increase from 30 to 45, so how do we get that additional 15? So here is our international terms of trade, right? So meaning that the US would be exchanging 1 wheat for every 1.5 coffee. So remember in our table just now, US decides to export 10 wheat, right? So 10 wheat here, so you just multiply with 1.5, so we get 15 coffee, okay? Similarly, the gains from trade is also experienced by Brazil. Now before, okay, if you remember here, if ever Brazil wants to have 1 more unit of wheat, it has to sacrifice or forego 2 units of coffee. But now Brazil doesn't have to do that. Okay, Brazil just needs to export 1.5 units of coffee to get 1 unit of wheat. So 1.5 is much smaller than 2. Okay, so in other words here, there will also be an increase, okay, by this amount. So this is also the increased trading possibilities line and an additional output area for Brazil. Okay, so why is it here? Because this is the maximum amount of coffee that Brazil can produce, and obviously since Brazil can now import more wheat, so they'll be able to increase the production of wheat as well.